Imagine living in a world where a king ruled by God's will, but your village bowed to a knight who answered to a duke who served a lord, who might defy the king entirely. In the medieval world, clothing wasn't just fashion, it was law. What you wore declared who you were, what you owned, and how far you could rise, or not. Sumptuary laws were rules designed to regulate what people could wear based on their social class, wealth, or occupation. Silk, velvet, fur, and gold thread were often reserved for nobles. Specific colors like royal purple or deep crimson were off-limits to peasants and merchants. Even shoe lengths were regulated, long, pointy toes for aristocrats only. The reasoning, to preserve the social hierarchy. If a merchant dressed like a baron or a wealthy widow adorned herself like a duchess, the illusion of order was shattered. These laws made sure everyone looked the part. Violating these laws could result in fines, public shaming, or confiscation of property. Yet people constantly tried to skirt the rules, wearing restricted fabrics in secret, bribing officials, or exploiting loopholes. Ironically, sumptuary laws were often passed when the middle class, especially merchants, grew too rich for the nobility's comfort. It wasn't about modesty, it was about control. In medieval law, your clothes could convict you. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, it didn't just kill millions, it shattered the legal and political structures that had defined medieval life for centuries. With up to half the population gone, labor became scarce and precious. Fields lay untended, nobles faced ruin. In desperation, peasants demanded higher wages and better treatment, but the ruling class struck back with laws. In England, the Statute of Labourers, 1351, made it illegal for workers to ask for higher pay or leave their manors in search of better work. Violators were branded as criminals. Other kingdoms passed similar laws, trying to freeze society in place as it unraveled. At the same time, inheritance laws were overwhelmed, with whole families wiped out, property passed in chaotic patterns, orphans flooded cities, courts struggled to keep up. The church, once a moral anchor, lost credibility. Many clergy fled or died. Some towns turned to local councils for leadership, planting the seeds of urban autonomy and legal reform. In trying to restore control, rulers exposed their fear and their fragility. The plague didn't just kill bodies, it undermined feudal law, exposed injustice, and opened doors for revolution. In 1215, a group of angry English barons cornered their king at a field called Runnymede and forced him to sign a document that would shake the foundations of monarchy forever, the Magna Carta. King John of England had taxed his nobles into fury, lost wars in France, and trampled on traditional rights. The barons rebelled, not to destroy the crown, but to limit it. Magna Carta wasn't a cry for democracy. It was a demand for balance, for the king to obey the law just like any subject. Among its revolutionary clauses, no man could be imprisoned without a fair trial. The king could no longer levy certain taxes without the consent of his barons. Even the church gained protection from royal interference. At the time, it was mostly ignored. King John broke his promises within weeks. Civil war followed, but the idea lived on. Centuries later, Magna Carta would inspire documents like the English Bill of Rights, the US Constitution, and modern concepts of liberty and justice. It was a crack in the armor of absolute rule, and once opened, the gap never closed. For centuries, peasants toiled under crushing taxes, feudal duties, and legal systems rigged against them. But sometimes, they rose, and when they did, medieval rulers trembled. One of the most famous uprisings came in 1381, the English Peasants' Revolt. Sparked by poll taxes and decades of exploitation, thousands of labourers marched on London, led by men like Wat Tyler and inspired by radical priests like John Ball. Their demands? Abolish serfdom, end feudal dues, equality before the law. They stormed castles, executed corrupt officials, and demanded the king listen. For a brief moment, the world turned upside down. Other revolts echoed across Europe: the Jacquerie in France, the Bundschuh in Germany, the Ciompi revolt in Florence. Though different in cause, all shared a common cry: justice. Most were brutally crushed, leaders were hanged, villages burned, reforms revoked, but the message was clear: the poor would not remain silent forever. These rebellions shook the legal and political order, forcing kings and lords to rethink taxes, labor, and law. The very foundations of feudalism began to crack. Medieval law was no longer unquestioned, it was challenged from below. In the medieval world, a spoken promise wasn't just a social formality, it was a sacred act, legally and spiritually binding. Oaths and vows were central to everything from politics to peasant life, and breaking one could carry both earthly punishment and eternal damnation. Oaths were often sworn on holy relics or sacred texts, invoking God as witness. A knight pledged loyalty to his lord, a king swore to uphold justice, a merchant vowed to honor a deal. These weren't empty gestures, they were contracts with divine consequences. Even in courts, testimony under oath was crucial. A man's word could condemn or free another, and lying under oath, perjury, was considered a mortal sin and legal offense. Vows were also central to religious life. Monks, nuns, and clerics took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, binding themselves to lives of service. But oaths could be manipulated. Clever phrasing, mental reservations, or swearing under duress allowed some to escape the consequences. Political leaders often broke oaths when convenient, then rushed to confess and be absolved. Still, for most people, a vow was sacred. To break it was to break trust with man and with God. Two great legal traditions emerged in medieval Europe, common law and Roman law, and their rivalry shaped the continent's justice for centuries. Common law, born in England, wasn't written down in neat codes. It evolved through customs, precedents, and court decisions. Judges relied on past rulings to decide current cases, creating a flexible, adaptable system. It emphasized local practices and relied heavily on jury trials. Over time, common law became the foundation of legal systems in Britain, the US, and much of the English-speaking world. In contrast, Roman law was rediscovered in the 11th century thanks to scholars in Italy poring over the Corpus Juris Civilis, the old Roman legal code compiled under Emperor Justinian. This written, systematic approach offered clarity and logic, with laws arranged by topic and principle. Roman law dominated the continent, influencing France, Germany, Spain, and beyond. Where common law trusted tradition and judges, Roman law trusted texts and scholars. One lived in practice, the other in theory. Medieval kings and churchmen chose sides, blending or resisting each system, but both left a lasting legacy. In medieval Europe, justice wasn't only in the hands of kings and barons, it was also in the hands of priests and bishops. The church courts, or ecclesiastical courts, formed a powerful parallel legal system, judging not just clergy, but often lay people as well. These courts handled moral and spiritual offenses, adultery, heresy, blasphemy, witchcraft, and even failure to pay tithes. But their reach extended further to marriage disputes, wills, contracts, and even accusations of sorcery or defamation. If it involved the soul, it was church business. Why did people prefer them? Church courts often gave lighter punishments than secular ones. Where a king's court might take your hand, the bishop's court might assign prayers or fasting. If you could claim benefit of clergy, even recite a single verse of scripture, you could be tried by church rather than civil law. But the system had flaws. Church courts were notoriously corrupt, often favoring the wealthy or influential. They could also act as instruments of control, silencing dissent with accusations of heresy. Still, they offered a rare place where even a peasant might argue before God's law rather than a noble's sword. What made a king a king? In the medieval world, the answer wasn't law, blood, or conquest alone. It was God's will. The divine right of kings claimed that monarchs ruled by heavenly appointment, not by the consent of their subjects. Their authority came not from men, but from the Almighty himself. To disobey the king was to defy God. This idea wasn't just religious, it was political armor. It shielded kings from rebellion and justified their absolute power. Even if a king was cruel or incompetent, his rule was seen as sacred. The church often reinforced this by anointing kings with holy oil, crowning them in cathedrals, and preaching sermons about royal obedience. But the truth was messier. Kings still needed armies, noble support, and church approval to stay on the throne. A weak monarch could be overthrown, God's will conveniently revised by his successor. Yet the idea of divine rule endured. It gave monarchs a myth of legitimacy, especially in times of crisis, and it kept the poor in line. Better to obey a bad king than risk eternal damnation. Medieval justice was as much about spectacle as it was about order. Punishment wasn't hidden behind prison walls. It was performed in the public square where the entire community watched and learned. Petty crimes, like drunkenness, gossip, or cheating a customer, were punished with the stocks or pillory. Offenders were locked into wooden frames, exposed to ridicule, rotten food, and worse. It wasn't just about pain, it was about shame. For more serious offenses, theft, treason, heresy, punishment turned gruesome. Whipping, branding, and mutilation were common. Thieves might lose a hand, perjurers could be branded on the face. Execution methods ranged from hanging and beheading to burning at the stake or being drawn and quartered. But justice wasn't blind. Nobles were more likely to receive fines or exile. Peasants suffered the lash and the rope, and women, especially those accused of witchcraft, were burned or drowned, with little chance of defense. Punishment wasn't just about deterrence, it reinforced social control. Public executions were performances of power, reminders of who ruled and who obeyed. Yet amid the cruelty, some systems of mercy existed: sanctuary in churches, pardons by the crown, and the growing use of juries. In a world dominated by kings, lords, and bishops, towns were supposed to serve, but by the High Middle Ages, cities began to fight back, not with swords, but with scrolls. Enter the city charter. A city charter was a legal document granted by a monarch, noble, or bishop that gave a town special rights. These might include the freedom to hold markets, elect officials, raise militias, or, most importantly, govern themselves. No more submitting to a feudal lord's justice or tax collector. With a charter, the town became a legal entity with a life of its own. Why did rulers allow this? Money. Cities were booming trade hubs. Merchants and craftsmen brought wealth, and that wealth needed protecting. A loyal, tax-paying city was more valuable than a rebellious, shackled one. Some towns bought their freedom outright. Others negotiated during wars or political crises. A few rose in open revolt. Across France, Italy, the Low Countries, and the German states, urban autonomy reshaped medieval politics. These city-states and chartered towns became centers of law, innovation, and rebellion, paving the way for modern civic government. Though the gallows are gone and the pillories have rotted away, the bones of medieval law still shape our world today. Many modern legal systems trace their roots to medieval frameworks. Common law, born in English royal courts, still governs countries like the United States, Canada, and India. Its reliance on precedent and jury trials remains a cornerstone of justice. The idea that no one is above the law, once radical in Magna Carta, is now foundational to constitutional democracies. Parliaments, rights-based legal systems, and trial procedures all owe debts to medieval innovations, however flawed they began. Even darker legacies linger. The use of torture in interrogations, once justified by church and crown, reappeared in modern wars and regimes. The branding of social outcasts, the criminalization of poverty, and unequal justice based on class or gender, all echo from those distant courts and councils. But the Middle Ages also planted seeds of resistance, from peasant revolts to city charters, that later grew into civil rights movements and democratic reforms. Medieval law was harsh, chaotic, and deeply biased, yet it also laid the groundwork for the legal ideals we still strive for today. In medieval Europe, the Pope wasn't just the head of the Church, he was one of the most powerful political figures on earth. From the 11th century onward, the papacy claimed supremacy not only in spiritual matters but over kings and emperors themselves. The Pope could crown a ruler or excommunicate him, stripping his divine legitimacy and turning his subjects against him. One of the most dramatic clashes came in 1077, when Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV defied Pope Gregory VII. In response, the Pope excommunicated him. Henry was forced to stand barefoot in the snow at Canossa, begging forgiveness for 3 days before being absolved. That wasn't just religion, it was political domination. Popes also launched crusades, reshaped borders, mediated royal disputes, and collected taxes from entire kingdoms. In some regions, papal law outweighed royal law, and local lords bent the knee to Rome more than to their own monarchs. But the Church wasn't immune to corruption or ambition. Popes played power games, funded armies, and even led wars. Some ruled like emperors in holy robes. The line between cross and crown was razor thin. To question the Church in medieval Europe was to risk everything, not just your freedom, but your life, your legacy, and your soul. Heresy wasn't just error, it was crime, and the punishment could be hell on earth. A heretic wasn't always a radical. Sometimes it was a scholar who challenged church doctrine, sometimes a preacher who spoke in the vernacular, sometimes a peasant with the wrong prayer. The church feared heresy because it threatened unity and authority, and so it struck back with terrifying force. The most feared tool? The Inquisition. Founded in the 13th century, the Inquisition hunted heretics across Europe. Trials were held in secret, accusers were anonymous, torture was legal, a confession meant reconciliation with punishment. Silence meant guilt. Recantation could spare your life but not your dignity. Refusal? Death. Famous cases include the Cathars of southern France, wiped out in a holy war and inquisitorial purge, or Joan of Arc, tried for heresy and burned, then declared a saint decades later. The line between law and belief blurred. The church became judge, jury, and, often, executioner. Faith had once offered hope. Now, it delivered judgment. In the Middle Ages, the worst punishment wasn't prison or execution, it was excommunication. To be cast out of the church was to be cut off from God, salvation, and society itself. Excommunication wasn't just spiritual, it had enormous political and legal power. A king under excommunication might lose the loyalty of his vassals, a merchant might be shunned, a peasant could be denied burial in consecrated ground. You couldn't take the sacraments, you couldn't marry in the church, you were dead in the eyes of Christendom. Popes and bishops wielded this tool like a weapon. Entire kingdoms were placed under interdict, shutting down churches and sacraments for everyone, just to pressure a monarch. One famous case, Pope Innocent III versus King John of England. The Pope excommunicated John and placed England under interdict until the king bowed. There were levels, minor excommunications for petty offences and major ones that exiled a soul entirely. Though reversible through penance and absolution, the stain could remain for life. Excommunication gave the church control beyond the pulpit. It turned law into fear and faith into leverage. In the medieval world, sometimes the only way to prove your innocence was to fight for it, literally. Welcome to trial by combat, where legal disputes were settled not in courtrooms but in dueling arenas. It was believed that God would grant victory to the rightful party. Two men, sometimes noble knights, sometimes common peasants, would swear oaths and then clash with swords, clubs, or axes until one yielded, was maimed, or died. The victor was declared innocent, the loser, guilty, and often dead. Not all combats were to the death. Some were highly ritualized, supervised by judges, and required only submission. Others were brutal free-for-alls. In rare cases, champions were allowed, trained fighters hired to battle in another's name, especially for women, clergy, or the elderly. One famous case occurred in 1386, when Jean de Carouge accused Jacques Legris of raping his wife. They fought in a Paris arena before a massive crowd. Carouge's won, and Legris was killed, his guilt never proven, only assumed. Trial by combat faded as legal systems matured, but the spectacle and myth endured. It was justice by strength, not truth. Welcome to medieval politics, a web of shifting loyalties, divine claims, and brute power. There was no single ruler, no supreme law. Authority was fractured between monarchs, nobles, the church, and even wandering warlords. A king might wear the crown, but control, that depended on whether his lords obeyed, whether the church supported him, and whether his army was paid. Some monarchs ruled vast realms with iron fists, others couldn't even collect taxes without begging their barons. Beneath the crown, a complex legal system simmered. Feudal contracts, church decrees, village customs, and royal edicts all collided. Justice varied wildly. In one town, theft meant mutilation. In another, it earned you penance. Power was decentralized and often violent. A duke could wage private war, a bishop might control more land than the king, and a peasant could be judged by 5 different courts, none of them fair. This chaos wasn't weakness, it was the foundation of the political systems that followed. In the ashes of the fallen Roman Empire, Europe fractured. No central government, no standing army, just fear, famine, and chaos. And from this vacuum rose a system that would define the Middle Ages: feudalism. At its heart, feudalism was a contract built on land and loyalty. Kings granted huge swathes of land, called fiefs, to powerful nobles. In return, those lords pledged loyalty and military support. But they didn't fight alone. They divided their land further among vassals, knights who swore fealty in exchange for their own slice of soil. It was a chain of obligations, land for service, loyalty for protection, but it wasn't neat. Some vassals served multiple lords, some lords defied their king, and peasants, they had no power, just the back-breaking duty to farm the land they'd never own. The king might be crowned, but the true power often lay with landowners, not lawgivers. A wealthy baron could raise an army, build castles, and defy the crown if his fiefs were large enough. Feudalism wasn't designed, it evolved, a patchwork solution to a world crumbling in disorder. For centuries, kings ruled with near total authority. But by the late Middle Ages, parliaments began to rise, councils of nobles, clergy, and sometimes commoners who demanded a say in how kingdoms were run. In England, this began with the Great Council, an advisory body of barons. Over time, especially after the Magna Carta, kings were forced to consult them more frequently. By the 13th century, under Edward I, the English Parliament took shape, now including knights and burgesses, voices from outside the aristocracy. Why did kings allow this? Simple: money. Wars were expensive. To raise taxes without rebellion, monarchs had to seek approval. Representation became the price of revenue. Elsewhere, similar assemblies emerged. The Estates General in France, the Cortes in Spain, and Reichstag in the Holy Roman Empire, each unique but all reflections of a growing truth. Power needed negotiation. These early parliaments didn't challenge the crown directly, but they planted a seed. Slowly, the idea grew. Rulers must answer to the ruled. It wasn't democracy, but it was a first step toward it. Medieval law claimed to uphold order and morality, but in reality, justice often depended on your purse and your birth. For the wealthy and noble, the legal system could be flexible, even forgiving. A knight who killed a peasant in a drunken brawl might pay a fine or make a religious offering. A baron who violated a land agreement could stall justice for years, hiding behind scribes, oaths, and bribes. Wealth could buy better advocates, favorable judges, and mercy. But for the poor, law was a different beast. A hungry peasant caught stealing a loaf of bread might lose a hand. A woman accused of gossiping about a priest could face public humiliation or worse. With little education and no influence, the poor were often tried quickly, punished harshly, and forgotten entirely. Even in jury trials, jurors came from the same class as the accused. But influence still mattered. Lords could pressure verdicts. Priests could sway judgment. Truth bowed to power. That's not to say all justice was corrupt. Many courts tried to be fair, but the scales were rarely balanced. In medieval Europe, the law had two faces: justice for the powerful, punishment for the powerless. Beneath the grandeur of kings and courts, real justice in medieval life was often delivered by men with boots on the ground: the sheriff, the bailiff, and the reeve. These local officials were the front lines of law and order. The sheriff, from Shire Reeve, represented the king's authority in each county. He collected taxes, summoned juries, enforced royal orders, and raised the local militia when needed. His word carried weight, and often fear. The bailiff, usually appointed by a lord or town council, managed estates, enforced manorial law, and supervised markets or fairs. He ensured peasants fulfilled their obligations, and sometimes presided over manorial courts. Then there was the reeve, often a peasant elected by villagers, who served as the bridge between lord and tenant. He kept peace within the manor, but had little real power beyond it. Justice was swift, but not always fair. A peasant could be punished for stealing grain, while a noble might walk free for worse. Bribes, favoritism, and revenge were common. Yet these men were crucial. Without them, the legal system would collapse. They were the invisible backbone of medieval justice, part administrator, part enforcer, part judge. Forget juries. In early medieval justice, guilt wasn't decided by evidence. It was determined by God himself through terrifying rituals known as trials by ordeal. There were many forms. In the ordeal of fire, the accused would carry a red-hot iron or walk barefoot over burning coals. Their wounds were then bandaged. If they healed cleanly within a set number of days, God had deemed them innocent. The ordeal of water flipped the logic. The accused was bound and thrown into a river. If they sank, they were innocent. Water had accepted them. If they floated, they were guilty, rejected by the holy element. Either way, many died. There was also the ordeal of the morsel. A priest would bless a bite of bread or cheese. If the accused choked, they were guilty. If they swallowed smoothly, they walked free. It was brutal, but deeply spiritual. People believed God's justice would prevail, especially when courts lacked records, laws, or trained judges. By the 13th century, the church began to condemn these practices. They were slowly replaced by evidence-based trials, but the legacy lingered. Justice had once been a matter of faith and fire,